In this session, we're going to explore targeted learning. Now, targeted learning has been proven in study after study to have an enormous effect size on the quality and success of learning. So what is targeted learning? Well, targeted learning is having a clear learning objective that's focused on what the students are actually learning and understanding rather than what they're doing, and a progressive success criteria. And why is targeted learning so important? Why does it have such a positive effect size on student outcomes and success? Well, I think there are lots of reasons for this. The most important one is simply this: students are novice learners. And by having a clear target for the session of learning, students can more effectively manage or focus or regulate their attention and learning effort. Learning is very effortful for students, and when they are clear about exactly where and how to apply that learning effort, all students are able to be so much more effective in their learning. Perhaps more important than the learning objective is the success criteria. The success criteria gives the students clarity about how the students will achieve the learning, what steps and approaches are necessary to be successful. As teachers, we are always engaged in our own learning and development, and I'm sure we all appreciate the importance of milestones along the way to some of our big learning objectives. Without these plateaus, it can be really challenging to maintain the motivation necessary to be successful. So firstly, with these milestones, with the success criteria in place, students are able to look at their current position and appreciate how much progress they have made, the movement between their starting point and where they are now. But they're also able to look ahead and see the goal getting closer, and the route to achieve that goal really clearly mapped out before them. A clear learning objective and progressive success criteria is also really important for a student's sense of how successful they're being within the learning and how successful they are as learners. Without having a clear learning goal to reference and clarity around what steps are necessary for success, how are students able to understand whether they're being successful? Well, there's only one way really, isn't there? By looking to the right, looking to the left, and comparing themselves against their peers. Now, if they look to their right and their peer is doing worse than them, or appears to be doing worse than them, then they're going to have a sense of triumph, a sense of success. It might not be earned. It may not be what we call intellectual confidence in HPL terms, but it might be confidence that is just based on the fact they're doing better than the person next to them. If they look to the person next to them and that person is doing better than them, then of course they're going to feel like they're failing. And so what we want students to be able to do is, instead of comparing themselves to their peers and making judgments about their success in learning against how successful the person sitting next to them is, we want them to be able to look to the success criteria and be able to understand exactly where they are on the route to their learning success. And be able to appreciate the movement that's happened since they began that learning journey. Imagine if I set you the goal of driving me home, but I didn't tell you where I lived and I didn't tell you how to get there. I didn't tell you that the car was running out of petrol, that the tyres didn't have enough air in them. I didn't tell you about 2 road closures on the way. I didn't tell you about the speed cameras. It's very unlikely that we would get to our destination. It's certainly unlikely that we would get there and still be friends, and either of us feeling like we'd been very successful. And yet sometimes we allow our students to experience learning in this way. We don't always target the learning sufficiently, giving sufficient clarity about what our learning intention or goal is or objective is, and outlining the steps that are necessary for success. So our students can look at the learning goal, look at the steps for success, and begin strategy planning, thinking about what parts of the learning are most likely to be more challenging for them, what parts of the learning are they currently most confident with, and they can map out where that cognitive effort is going to go and approach the learning with much more confidence. Okay, so we've accepted that targeted learning is really important. So then the big question is, well, how do we target learning effectively then? What does a very effective learning objective look like, please? And I've got some guidance for you. We'll have a look at some examples too. And some of this guidance might seem a bit obvious, but I do think it's important to refocus our attention on these principles. Number one, learning objectives should focus on what we want the students to learn as opposed to what we want them to do. And it should put greater emphasis on the process of learning over the completion of the task or the end product. And it should include words associated with learning, like to know, to understand, to reflect, to review, to think. So let's think about that. It sounds really obvious, doesn't it, to focus in the learning objective on what they're learning. But quite often, I see learning objectives that are focused on the outcome, on the task. So it might be ELO to divide a 3-digit number by a 1-digit number, or ELO to write the opening for my fairy tale. Now, both of those are outcome focused. So what would we do to make that more focused on learning, the process of learning, and making sure that we include words associated with learning? So you, instead of saying to write an opening for a fairy tale as a learning objective, you might have ELO to understand how to write an interesting and descriptive story opener. And I said story opener rather than fairy tale because the next point is really important too. Our learning objectives should be universal, meaning that we can apply them and transfer what we're learning here to other contexts too. So yes, in today's lesson, you'll be applying the learning of writing a descriptive and interesting opener to a fairy tale genre of story, but actually much of that learning will apply to other story types too. So you can provide context separately. So you might write ELO to understand how to write an interesting and descriptive story opener, context, fairy tale stories. And ultimately, the learning objective should be accessible for all of the students, and it should be in child-friendly language. Maybe even if you have some English as an additional language students in the classroom, you might want to make sure you've got a relevant image on the slide that will help guide those students too. Now, there are certainly subjects like science, geography, history, sometimes in maths, where you're introducing subject-specific language. And it's okay to have those words in there, but when sharing the objective, you need to reassure the students at that point that you will be learning what that word means. And as best as possible, make sure that the learning objective is something that all of the students can access and all of the students can understand. So let's look at an example. So if we have to plan my non-chronological report, we would change that to ELO to understand how to plan an informative and interesting piece of writing. Context, non-chronological report. The phrase to understand how to plan focuses the students' learning on the process of learning rather than the outcome. And we're using words associated with learning like understand and plan. The second part of the learning objective, to plan an informative and interesting piece of writing, well, that's universal, much more universal than putting my non-chronological report. By doing that, we create synergy in the learning, which means that the students will be able to apply what they've learned in other areas of the curriculum or in other different writing genres. We make it clear that in the context of this lesson, we're going to be applying these skills within a non-chronological report. But we keep the learning objective universal, so students know they're learning skills today that they can apply in different areas too. Here we take the learning objective to identify moral lessons in a play script, and we change it so the ELO reads to develop strategies to infer the morals and values encouraged in a text, the context being play scripts. So the phrase to develop strategies to infer, that's focused on learning, that's focused on the process of learning rather than the outcome. morals and values encouraged in a text. That's to make it clear to the student that they can apply this process to other text and other reading. And then we provide the context below, which is play scripts in today's instance. So that's learning objectives, but what about success criteria? Well, when writing success criteria, they should begin with the action verb I can. All criteria and steps should apply to all students. Remember, our goal is to get every student into that higher order thinking zone. They should outline the progressive actions that students need to master and achieve success, and using Bloom's taxonomy as a guide. And I'm going to provide further information about how we do that and what Bloom's taxonomy is. And it should, like the learning objectives, be accessible to all students and in student-friendly language. A key part of a successful success criteria is that it's progressive, that it carefully guides the student up towards the learning goal, the learning objective. And to guide the process of creating a progressive success criteria, you should be referring to Bloom's taxonomy of higher order thinking. And there's an illustration of the structure of that on the slide. Bloom's taxonomy is a way of organising different ways of thinking and handling information in the brain, from the least demanding and complex, so remembering and understanding at the bottom, to the most demanding and complex, to analysing, evaluating and creating at the top. And these are referred to as lower order thinking and higher order thinking. So the lower order thinking skills would be remembering, understanding and applying, and the higher order thinking skills would be analysing, evaluating and creating. It's really important to note that the taxonomy is not an illustration of the importance of each way of thinking or handling information. There is no judgment here. Creating isn't a more important way of handling information and thinking than remembering. In fact, we can't achieve any of the higher order ways of handling information or thinking unless we're working well at remembering, understanding and applying in the lower order fields. And this is why it's really important that success criteria is progressive, starting with the lower order skills. So students have the time and the opportunity to develop those necessary lower order skills of remembering, understanding and applying in order to be able to be successful at analysing, evaluating and creating. So how do we apply Bloom's taxonomy to the construction of progressive success criteria? Well, the first thing we do is a quick Google search for Bloom's taxonomy action verb list, and you'll get lots and lots of different examples. I've chosen quite a comprehensive one here with lots and lots of different verbs on it, but if you're unfamiliar with them, you might want to choose one of the simpler versions, maybe has 5 or 6 different verbs within each field until you become more familiar with that. And then it's important we look to the learning objective and we ask ourselves, okay, within remembering or knowledge and understanding, what are those first initial steps that the students are going to have to be able to do in order to support them to get up to that higher order learning goal that we're setting ourselves? And so if we've got the learning objective to understand what makes an effective persuasive text with the context of an advert, I've selected I can identify common features of a persuasive text. So the first thing that they're going to be able to do is look at different examples of a persuasive text and identify those things that are common features across all of them. That's the first step that I felt within that remembering or knowledge phase that they would have to be able to do. And then to progress that journey more towards understanding what makes an effective persuasion text, I thought they would have to work at the level of analysing. So they'd have to analyse those features and be able to explain the purpose of each of those features. So starting to think like the author, starting to think like a writer, and thinking about the intention that they're having on the audience. And we see explain happening in understand and also occurring again in analyse. And we're working at the level of analysis here, aren't we? Because we're asking the students to, once they've identified the features, analyse them and then explain what they think the purpose of those features are. And then lastly, I've chosen 2 verbs, one from the evaluate column and one that should be in the create column, but these lists are not exhaustive, so you have to use your own knowledge and understanding and a bit of intuition as well. And I've chosen I can evaluate and improve a persuasive text. Now, if we look at the learning objective to understand what makes an effective persuasive text, it certainly addresses that, but it seems to edge beyond it. And that's really important, because one of the things that we want to do through our ambitious teaching and learning is ensure that a significant number, over 75% of the learners, achieve better than expected outcome. Now, that's based on their starting point, but this would be commonly accepted as better than expected if they're starting at the age expected levels. That by the end of the lesson, they should be able to look at a text, a persuasive text, that it isn't really bad, but it isn't really good, and they should be able to evaluate it and up-level and improve it. And that will show that they're working beyond the age expected level. And finally, I've just got 3 further considerations when you're targeting your learning. And the first one is 3 is not the magic number. Now, yes, of course, when it comes to success criteria, there's a reason why we commonly have 3 success criteria. We don't want to overwhelm the students with too many, and any lesson, it suggests that the learning itself may not be challenging enough. But it's okay, you can go up to 5 if you want, and in some cases, maybe even further. It depends on the duration of the period of learning, but also the students themselves as well. So some students might have less success criteria in order to achieve the learning outcome, and some students might need more. Let's imagine we have students coming with more prior learning and less prior learning. The students who come with more prior learning might only need 3 success criteria to achieve the learning outcome. But the students who come with less prior learning, they might need 4 or 5 success criteria in order to reach that final learning goal. They might need to spend 2 or 3 success criteria in the lower order regions of the lesson in order to prime themselves and be ready for the higher order aspects of learning. And so it's a good way to show that you are personalising and differentiating for different groups of learners and different individuals within your lesson. So 3 is a good number of success criteria, but you may want to add or take away some depending on the starting points of the learners to create those individual pathways through the lesson. Secondly, second consideration number 2, don't withhold. When you're targeting the learning with the learning objective and the success criteria, that's when you can bring in your examples and show this is what a really good one looks like, this is what an okay one looks like, this is what a bad one looks like. Can you see the difference? Can you see the success criteria represented in these examples? Don't withhold till the end. It's really beneficial for students to be able to see this is what we're working towards. And lastly, be clear what better than expected looks like. It should be clear to you, it should be clear to the students from the outset of the lesson. We want to create a really ambitious learning culture in the school, and that requires everybody to be working towards better than expected and to understand how they're going to get there. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it useful. Of course, if you want any further support or guidance, please get in touch with me.